Well, yes, indeed. Thank you, Nathan. We do hope motorists will heed the advice of the authorities so that we all can have it as easy, at least, as can be. All right, let's talk now to Mr. Daniel Boala. He joins us this morning. He's a legal practitioner. He's also a member of Lincoln's Inn in London. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Well, talking about elections, security, how do we ensure we improve it? We have to keep bringing in suggestions, solutions, hoping that at the end of the day, they will take it in, those who are meant to implement it. But highlighting some of the challenges we face at the moment, which is why we're coming up with this one. Right. Only recently, we've seen rivers. We saw Ekiti. People talked about it that much. But having then seen the way the rivers elections went, and yourself, you're going to get into the particular arena sooner rather than later. What kind of concerns do you have about it?
Well, thank you for having me. When it comes to the security of our election, I think we have a fundamental problem. And as a lawyer, I can only talk from the perspective of law, looking at the regulatory framework for electioneering process in Nigeria. Fundamentally, if you're talking of security of election, you're looking at the laws that will be enforced against those who default the electoral rules and procedure, which of course will give you recourse to the Electoral Act. And Section 24 of the Electoral Act outlines electoral offenses. The problem is that all of the offenses highlighted in Section 24 of the Electoral Act are happening every day, perpetrated by all political parties and political gladiators. So I have come to a point where I consider Section 24 as an unrealistic law, because if you look at Section 24, you will see that liability for electoral offense in terms of whether vote buying, bribery, whatever. In fact, if you juxtapose that with the guidelines of INEC, I think of 2015, when it talks about offenses that are committed on the day within the circumference of the polling unit. If you combine these two, the Electoral Act and the guidelines of INEC, I'm telling you, like in these 3 states, in recent time that we have seen, from the candidates which of course at the time they were being interviewed, I think after the election or so, and they admitted and they were saying, oh, the other person also did it. There is strict liability, there is vicarious liability, there is liability of knowledge. Strict liability is by those who pay or buy the votes. So you that receive money to vote, you've also committed the offense. The man who pays you the money has committed the offense. Vicarious liability, you that sponsored the buying of the vote, you're also liable. Then there's liability of knowledge. You are aware and you are part of the political process, canvassing for the vote of that individual, and the conversation was made to your knowledge or in your presence for the purposes of buying the vote. You're also liable. Now, it says you will be prosecuted for over 80% of the offenses there are to be, with maximum punishment of, I think, 500,000 naira, or a prison of 12 months, or both. Now, let's take a case study of a polling unit. The people involved in vote buying and vote selling and bribery and everything in a particular polling unit might be more than 60 or 70. And I heard recently INEC celebrating the fact that they successfully prosecuted 60 people. So they have succeeded in the past 3 years in prosecuting people that can be construed as, people in one polling unit. And think of how many polling units you have in the local government, in the states, and then you talk it around to the federation. That makes the implementation of the law unrealistic. The second and most important point, which relates to security, is who arrests this individual? How many policemen do we have in a polling unit? How many civil defense do we have in polling unit? And DSS. And then there are some security organizations that must also be careful about their mandate in relation to the arrest and prosecution of individuals at the polling unit.
If I could take you back on 2 of the 3,
right?
That you spoke about, the vicarious liability and by knowledge.
Right.
No, not strict yet, because if you look at those last 2, doesn't it make it a little more difficult for prosecution? Because if you want to prosecute me based on the fact that, vicariously and by knowledge, that is going to take a longer time.
Right.
But if it were a strict liability, I think that looks a little more straightforward. But even if you combine all of those,
Right.
do the laws make it far much more difficult such that it becomes unenforceable?
Right. It is far difficult, and I will tell you why. Because number one, who arrests and who prosecutes? INEC or the police?
The Bible was argued about that. I
Right.
remember we asked INEC. INEC said, well, the police are there. They know what the electoral law says or act says. They should be able to see and arrest. And we said, but aren't you supposed to point them to some of those saying, look, this is a crime, and so we think that you should go ahead and prosecute. So it's always going back and forth between INEC and police.
So let's take example of a polling unit in Ekiti in the last election. In a particular polling unit, you don't see more than probably 5 or 7 police officers. And assuming this crime is perpetrated by people constituting of up to maybe, let's say, 40 people, how can 6 police officers arrest 40? That's one unrealistic.
Unarmed at that.
Pardon?
They're supposed to be unarmed.
Most of the police, yeah, unarmed, correct. And most of the crimes are committed not just with their knowledge, but sometimes with their consent, because they may have been bribed as well, in order to allow.
But that's the realm of speculation.
That's why I want to move to the next level, because I try to talk about the impossibility by virtue of the number of police that you have and the arrest to be made, and then secondly, it goes to the issue of proof, as contained in the Evidence Act, which comes to the issue of speculation. Now, how do I prove this police officer has knowledge of this arrangement? How do I prove this police officer also received money? How can I prove that Senator XYZ actually bribed or gave the money for vote buying? Because you have to be there. And then when it comes to the issue of proof, then you have to look at the Evidence Act is what will apply. And you know that when it comes to proof, you have to know your homework.
Yeah.
So to me, to be honest, all the stakeholders in the electioneering process will not be interested in bringing this to an end, because for the most part, they are beneficiaries of this. Now, we have come to a point in Nigeria where an average politician you meet does not believe he will win election without talks, does not believe he will win election without money. You know the restrictions, the limitation of the amount that a particular candidate will spend in election. And you know that most of the candidates for election spend far more than that. How do you prove it? INEC will tell you, well, we will find a way of looking at bank and their transaction. People spend by proxies. So we have, to me, electoral law for the purposes of punishing electoral offenses that is completely unrealistic. How many police officers do we have in the country? And during election, even if you deploy the entire police force of Nigeria to a particular state that is conducting election for governorship right down, it will be difficult for them to take care of this Section 24.